Good morning. My name is Aisha K. Staggers, and I usually get very nervous doing these kinds of things. But I've got my people here, Jill, my sister, my daughter, so I'm good. Um, my presentation is called Baby, You're Much Too Fast, Vanity 6 and the Sexual Aesthetic of the 80s and Beyond. Um, when we talk about sexual aesthetics, we aren't always talking about physical appearance. There are also a set of aesthetic principles that guide artists' work. These can either be ascribed or achieved, and being fast is something that, for much of history, was ascribed to those music artists, specifically female artists, who were black famous. Does anybody know what black famous is? Just clap if you know black famous. Okay. Sorry. So the term black famous has been around underground in black cultural circles for a long time, but Michael Harriot of The Root brought it to surface on Twitter in 2019 when he asked the question, who is the most black famous person of all time? Harriet defined black famous as the highest possible rating on the black famous scale that would be someone everyone who is black knew but was unknown by every white person. So those are artists who never had any type of mainstream crossover successes on the pop charts, um, like Madonna or any member of the vocal trinity, Whitney Houston, Celine Dion, Mariah Carey. Um, though it was Mariah Carey's venture into being black famous with her remixes. So that there's a caveat there for that, but it allowed her to be both pop famous and black famous. Now, as a side note, there are white artists who are black famous, like Tina Marie and Bobby Caldwell. So being part of a multiracial group like Vanity Six doesn't preclude that. Prince was actually black famous when he first started out before 1999. And The Time before Purple Rain was also black famous. Vanity Six, however, started off black famous, but as a group never really got out of the black famous category except among Prince fans. So having the next slide. Having black famous status doesn't offer the same kind of protection that mainstream fame does. Black famous artists, specifically women, are set to experience an artistic life of racism, one that many believe doesn't matter because of skin color. But they also have to deal with misogyny, and that the misogyny that comes with being a woman, specifically a particular type of misogyny reserved for black women that combines both sexism and racism into something called misogynoir. Now, along with that are sexual stereotypes that you must encounter while trying to figure out how to express yourself as a sexual being without being exploited. And this is particularly true for black female musicians. The first black female group to really take being black famous worldwide on a scale never before achieved and to gain that level of crossover recognition that we rarely see was the Supremes, as Robin mentioned, coming out of Motown in the 1960s. But in the 1970s, there were also other groups like Sister Sledge, the Pointer Sisters, and the Jones Girls, all of whom were groups of siblings. And so when you're talking about female sexual aesthetics, you don't really see female family groups talking about sex. You don't talk about sex with your family. It's something you do better with your friends. You can ask my sister how many times we've never talked about it. But by the 1980s, you also begin to see different representations of black women in groups like Klymaxx and the Mary Jane Girls. And then, of course, there was Vanity Six. Also in the 80s, you had Salt and Pepper, whose first crossover hit was Sexual in Nature with Push It in the late 80s. In the 90s, TLC changed that notion of the female sex symbol and how they dressed, as Robin mentioned. By their second album, they were more sexual. And by the time that they reached supreme level success with Waterfalls, they had vastly changed their image into something that could be acceptable to a crossover audience. The baggy pants, midriff tops, the condoms everywhere were not appealing to mainstream, specifically white audiences. So, moving from the 80s, there were actually an abundance of groups, mostly one hit wonders, who followed this style that was pretty much started with groups like Vanity Six. You don't really know who they are because they were what? Black famous, right? So this began to transform a generation of 90s women who eventually became women of the 2000s, women of the 2010s. And so you end up with artists like Beyonce, Rihanna, and Lizzo who express their sexuality in similar ways that harken back to what 80s girl groups like Vanity Six did, but also have something else to bring to the forefront. So, the day after Vanity passed away, Les Fabian Braithwaite wrote in Out magazine that Prince wrote the raunchiest female anthem of the 80s. They go on to say that few songs have ever been so gloriously trashy or so perfectly perverse. And depending on how you see it, it's either an ode to sexual liberation, as three women state plainly and rather explicitly their desires, or it's an ode to sexual exploitation, as Prince two steps over the gender divide to translate his erotic fantasies through three empty vessels. I actually disagree that Denise, Susan, and Brenda were empty vessels. I think that there was something about Vanity Six that they were as much about sexual liberation and exploration as they were about exploitation, but were kind of in on the joke of being exploited. And you get that through some of the songs and the skits that they had, that they're like, this is fun, and we can kind of laugh about it at the same time. So knowing how small C conservative the 80s were, the idea that women who showed off a little skin or spoke in ways that were considered raunchy were being exploited by men, for Vanity Six, they were part of the joke. They got what was going on. But the sexual exploitation of women of color is not a joke. It's actually something that is used as a method of control, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So, looking at Vanity Six, you can see that there are really three types of black music when you take a song, for example, like Nasty Girl. And black music is unapologetically sexual. It's also unapologetically feminist when women are performing it. So if you're Gen X like myself and older, and you grew up on your parents' saccharine-flavored pop where Leslie Gore sang about sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, then Vanity Six was any one of these descriptions that I've seen people write. Overtly sexual, had a distinct sexual image, the key word being distinct, the quintessential sexual woman, and having the same sexual urges as a man. But if you grew up on rock and roll of Little Richard, R&B of Motown, and the funk of the 70s and the early days of the blues, then Vanity Six was like a mirror, especially if you were a black or brown girl. Again, black famous. So the term rock and roll has been attributed to Alan Freed. However, he took that from a 1951 R&B song by Billy Ward and his Dominoes called 60-Minute Man, which it is what it said. It's about what it says it's about. But at that time, rock and roll and pop were used interchangeably. Then there's rhythm and blues. The term rhythm and blues has been attributed to Jerry Wexler. Again, not another black author or radio personality, but Jerry Wexler wrote for Billboard, and in 1949, Billboard wanted to replace the category of race music with something else, and so they used rhythm and blues. And race music, like rhythm and blues, was considered to be controversial because it was considered a bad influence on white youth, because it explored two things that were considered cultural taboos: race and sex, and brought the two of them together. And it's also used interchangeably with soul music. And then there's funk. Now, we mostly associate funk with the 50s, 60s, and 70s, starting with artists like James Brown. But actually, funk has its origins in New Orleans as early as the 1900s and has been cultivated over time. Now, you take a group like Vanity Six, and they embody all three of those. Brenda's the rock and roll, Susan was the R&B, the soul, the heart, and Vanity was the funk. Now, before I get to this, visually, as Robin mentioned, the Ronettes were the bad girls of the 60s. But that was really in terms of their physical appearance, because their music still retained the innocence of the 1960s. The lyrics did. The most controversial song actually produced by Phil Spector, who produced the Ronettes, was one that was given to the Crystals called He Hit Me and It Felt Like a Kiss, which referenced relationship violence in a pretty sickeningly positive way, which we know often coincides with sexual violence. And particularly for women of color to be singing that song, it is a bit more than disturbing. But the Supremes, they specifically catered to a kind of glamour, a showing that Black people like Nina Horn and Diane Carroll can also be glamorous because they're being seen on TV more. And actually, Oprah Winfrey specifically mentioned seeing Diana Ross and the Supremes on Ed Sullivan as having an impact on her as a young Black girl. And the closest the Supremes ever came to really exploring sexuality in their music was with Love Child, and the idea of having an out-of-wedlock child in 1968. Let's see. But Diana Ross, when she left the group continued to do that 1960s love song thing. However, Diana Ross moved over to Love Hangover, which was a more sexually graphic song along the lines of Donna Summer's Love to Love You, Baby. So you have single Black women who are Black famous, because Diana Ross, as a solo artist, it took her a minute to become mainstream famous, but they were having to compete. And they were allowed a little bit more freedom than the context of being in a girl group. Now, Vanity Six was not the first group to really discuss sexually explicit lyrics, to have sexually explicit lyrics in their songs. This can go back all the way to 1924. These are Black female artists whose lyrics are more graphic than anything I've seen in Nasty Girl. Nasty Girl is actually the most conservative of these songs. And the one that really gets me is Shave 'Em Dry. That's actually the most vulgar of these. Okay. So you might want to screenshot that and have a listen. So, like my daughter said when I had her organize this list by year to me, I don't want to hear anyone over 50 talk about how nasty Gen Z's lyrics are. Because you, Nana, and Grandma, which she calls my great grandmother, it's all this. Okay. So, when Vanity left the group and signed to Motown as a solo artist, she really left a mark. It would seem like an odd fit, her leaving Prince's camp for Motown. Again, by the 80s, Motown still had the same kind of ideas with regard to image of their artists. Particularly for female solo artists, since the Berry Gordy days, all except for one, which would be Tammy Terrell, who was really Motown's original fast girl. Now, if you thought the Ronettes were fast, Tammy Terrell was fast in a different way. And that has its roots in being sexually assaulted. The promiscuity came as a result of that, which I mentioned earlier, comes with also physical relationship violence, which we also know about was something that she went through. But the 70s embraced some of these nuances with regard to including sexuality in music in a way that was different than those songs that I previously mentioned, mostly because the women were fully clothed in 1924 singing about sex in that manner. But by 1970s, people were wearing a little less clothing. But also people continued to be very savvy in terms of how they wrote the lyrics about sex. But it also could be painful for some. For example, in the 1970s, LaBelle did Lady Marmalade, which is glamorous life light. And I actually want to one day ask Prince how that song might have inspired his writing, Prince's writing of the glamorous life, because he did work with Patti LaBelle. I'm sure that's a conversation that might have been had. But Patti lamented once that it took her to sing about a prostitute to get the kind of attention and recognition she didn't get otherwise for her vocal talent, because she was what? Black famous. Now, in the 80s, like I said, girl groups did embrace sexuality, none more than Vanity 6. The Mary Jane Girls had a powerhouse vocalist, and they all exuded sexuality, but there was also a kind of modesty to them because their lead vocalist wasn't as overtly sexual as other members of the group. And then you had Klymaxx, which was Vanity 6 with instruments, but a bit more bravado. And so it was easier to compare them as a female version to some of the male bands that were out, like the Commodores, like The Time, which Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis did eventually work with them on an album. And like I said, the Pointer Sisters and Sister Sledge had that family thing going on, and the sexuality was toned down for moms and dads, but they also came from gospel backgrounds. So that too had an impact. Now in the 90s, there was TLC, as I mentioned, but there was also SWV, Escape, 702, all of whom were Black famous. But those last three, specifically SWV, 702, and Escape, they placed emphasis on vocal talent. And initially were molded in the image of TLC, but eventually, in order to try and cross over, took on this image that was, really characterized by Vanity 6. But even TLC, as I said, rejected that aesthetic of being hip hop, male-like. And that will be a conversation for another time, because I can go on that all day. But not one generation of R&B music was just about love. So to say that is to misrepresent the genre entirely. It has always included sex, it has always included vulgarity, and it has always in some way exploited women. And we make this mistake because it is a genre closely associated with the gospel. And that's why there is this element of shame when you have female artists who do want to, wear a short skirt or, sing about things that they're going through, as opposed to singing about things that are nice and sweet all the time. You had Millie Jackson, Betty Wright, and Ma Rainey, all of whom had sexually explicit lyrics, and all of whom were also affiliated with the church. Even authors like Maya Angelou, Angela Davis, Nikki Giovanni, and Tazaki Shange, and Audre Lorde brought these themes into their writing. And so the music reflected the writing, and vice versa. The writing reflected the music. In 1991, Patricia Hill Collins' book, Black Feminist Thought, was groundbreaking, especially for Gen X young women who were learning that there are these stereotyped images for Black girls and women that were hypersexual, immoral, and dishonest. And they controlled our womanhood and our independence, our sexuality, and our fertility. There were four main images she discussed. There was the mammy, who was the faithful, obedient domestic servant. She's also very asexual. There was the matriarch, who was strong, independent, aggressively angry, and emasculating. There was the welfare mother, who were considered breeders, and they were dependent on government assistance, and also their fertility needed to be controlled by the government. And then there was the Jezebel, the whore, the sexually aggressive woman, and considered open to sexually being abused. These were women that were considered unrapeable in slavery times. Now, the Jezebel also has another cultural colloquialism. It's called the fast-tailed girl. In 2013, Mickey Kendall, who has a website called Hood Feminism, who also wrote a book in 2020 called Hood Feminism, started a hashtag on Twitter called Fast-Tailed Girls and encouraged Black women and brown women to talk about the ways that they were considered fast-tailed girls. It could have been something as benign as the color lipstick they wore, red lipstick, or they happened to wear a mini skirt. They could have had tights under it. But it was always the perception of other people being transposed onto Black girls. And we're talking about not women who are 18 and over. We're talking about young girls, girls as young as 4 and 5. And in her essay in her book, Hood Feminism, on fast-tailed girls, she starts by saying, like a lot of others, I was a fast-tailed girl before I really understood what those words meant. Now, essentially, Vanity 6, in particular, was purported to be a mirror image of Prince in female form. The male version, the male response to these quote-unquote fast-tailed girls is either bam or nah. But then there's the Prince response, which is when a woman does what I do, watch out. But Prince also kind of had this juxtaposition. If you listen to the lyrics of Little Red Corvette, baby, you're much too fast. On one hand, he's enticed by this, but on the other hand, it's like, girl, you need to slow down. You're kind of hot in the pants there. But, Vanity 6 did make a comeback in a different form. In 1989, Motown revamped, after being sold by Berry Gordy to MCA, their new president, Joe Busby, revamped the label and tried to do a revival. And it's very clear that Vanity herself left a mark on the label, because when they did it, they brought out a group of girls called the Good Girls. Now, these are Motown ladies over the time. These are the Good Girls. The Good Girls were supposed to be a version of Vanity 6 that were good on the outside, but their lead singer looked so much like Vanity that they made them kind of bad. So they had the short skirts, they were dancers. The vocal ability and vocal talent was pretty much the same, but in that one picture in the middle top, you notice the writing on the board, I will be a good girl. So they were able to blend those two things from Motown, Vanity and Diana Ross and the Supremes. And they did it pretty successfully. And I wondered if this was really a true inspiration. And it is, because this is their official Instagram page. And most of the pictures that are not them are of Vanity 6. So, one last thing. We're talking about bad girls here. We're talking about Vanity 6 being bad girls. Inside every woman, there's a bad girl, and every musical generation is going to have them. So, that's how to find me. Thank you.